Deep in the hills of rural Kentucky, two sisters built walls that kept the world out and their secrets in. For over 20 years, Martha and Sarah Whitlock lived behind locked gates and towering fences, while neighbors whispered about strange sounds echoing through the hollow at night. The mail carrier never saw children, yet grocery deliveries were always large enough for a small army. When social services finally forced their way past those rusted gates, they discovered 12 children who had never seen a doctor, never attended school, and never stepped foot beyond the compound's borders. These weren't just neglected children. They were the product of generations of inbreeding, raised in complete isolation by sisters who believed the outside world was too corrupt for their sacred bloodline. But what drove two women to create their own twisted version of paradise? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Detective Sarah Chen pulled her cruiser up to the rusted gate that had become the stuff of local legend. 23 years on the force, and she'd never seen anything quite like the Whitlock compound. The chain-link fence stretched 12 feet high, topped with coils of razor wire that caught the morning sunlight like broken glass. Weeds grew through the metal mesh, and wooden boards had been wired to the inside, blocking any view of what lay beyond. Margaret Hayes, the county's head of Child Protective Services, stepped out of her sedan with a manila folder clutched against her chest. At 58, she'd seen every form of neglect and abuse imaginable, but something about this place made her hands shake as she approached the gate. The anonymous tip that brought them here had been specific. 12 children living in conditions that violated every health and safety code on the books. "You sure about this, Maggie?" Chen asked, fingering the bolt cutters in her belt. The legal paperwork gave them authority to enter, but 20 years of isolation had a way of making people unpredictable. Hayes nodded toward the compound beyond the fence. Someone called in that tip for a reason. Said they'd seen children through gaps in the fence, kids who looked malnourished and dirty. If there's even a chance the detective had grown up in these hills, every county had its stories, its whispered legends about the families who disappeared into the hollows and never came back out. The Whitlocks had been hermits for as long as anyone could remember, but hermits were common enough in Appalachia. It was only in recent months that the rumors had turned darker. Mrs. Patterson from the general store had mentioned the grocery orders. Bulk rice, flour, and canned goods delivered monthly to the compound's gate. Enough food for a small army, she'd said, but nobody ever saw more than the two sisters. Tom Bradley, who delivered propane tanks, claimed he'd heard children's voices echoing from somewhere inside the property. But he'd never seen a soul besides Martha and Sarah Whitlock. Chen cut through the chain with practiced efficiency. The lock fell to the gravel with a metallic clang that seemed to echo off the surrounding hills. As the gate swung open on squealing hinges, both women paused. The smell hit them first, a mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else they couldn't quite identify. A gravel path led through overgrown brush toward a cluster of ramshackle buildings. The main house looked like it had been built in the 1940s and never properly maintained since. Grey paint peeled from weathered siding, and several windows were boarded over with mismatched planks. Two smaller outbuildings flanked the main structure, their roofs patched with sheets of corrugated metal and blue tarps. "Hello?" Hayes called out as they approached. "Child Protective Services. We need to speak with Martha and Sarah Whitlock." The front door opened with a bang, and Martha Whitlock emerged like a fury from the Old Testament. At 61, she was tall and gaunt, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her dress was homemade from rough brown fabric, hanging loose on her angular frame. But it was her eyes that stopped both women in their tracks. Pale blue and blazing, with the kind of righteous anger that had started religious wars. "You have no business here," Martha declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "This is private property, sanctified ground. You'll leave now or face the judgment that comes to all who interfere with God's work." Chen's hand moved instinctively to her service weapon. In 2 decades of law enforcement, she'd learned to recognize the particular brand of fanaticism that made people dangerous. Martha Whitlock radiated that intensity, the absolute certainty that made compromise impossible. "Ma'am, we have a court order," Hayes said, holding up the legal documents. "We've received reports of children living on this property without proper medical care or education. We're here to ensure their welfare." Sarah Whitlock appeared in the doorway behind her sister, smaller and softer around the edges, but sharing those same pale, burning eyes. She clutched a leather-bound book against her chest, her lips moving in what might have been prayer or curse. "Show me these children," Chen said firmly. "Now!" That's when they heard it, the sound that would haunt both women's dreams for years to come. From somewhere deep within the compound came a child's voice, thin and reedy, calling out in words they couldn't quite understand. Then another voice joined it, and another, until a chorus of young voices rose from the buildings like smoke from a hidden fire. The family Bible sat open on Martha's kitchen table, its leather binding cracked and stained from decades of handling. The pages were thick with handwritten notes, genealogy charts that spiraled inward like a twisted family tree. Detective Chen studied the entries while Martha stood rigid in the corner, her eyes never leaving the sacred book that had guided 3 generations of Whitlock decisions. Martha and Sarah had been born into this very compound in 1963, the daughters of Ezra and Ruth Whitlock. Their father had inherited the property from his own parents, who'd built the original homestead in 1924, after fleeing what they called the corruptions of town life. Each generation had added to the walls, both physical and spiritual, that separated them from the outside world. "My grandfather saw the truth," Martha said, her voice carrying the weight of inherited conviction. "He understood that the bloodline must remain pure, untainted by the wickedness that spreads through modern society like a plague. Every year the world grows more corrupt, more godless. We are the remnant, the chosen few who will inherit the earth when the cleansing comes." Sarah nodded from her position by the window, still clutching her own worn book of prayers. Where Martha burned with righteous fire, Sarah seemed to float in a kind of dreamy certainty, as if she lived partially in another realm, where their actions made perfect sense. Chen had seen the photographs hanging in the hallway, faded portraits of Whitlock ancestors, stretching back nearly a century. The family resemblance was unmistakable. The same pale eyes and sharp features repeated generation after generation. But there was something else in those faces, a kind of hollow intensity that spoke of too much intermarrying, too many years of genetic isolation. "Your parents," Hayes prompted gently. "They raised you here, just the 2 of you." Martha's jaw tightened. "We had a brother, but he was weak. The Lord called him home when he was 12, before he could contaminate the bloodline with his impurity." The social worker made careful notes, recognizing the euphemisms that often mask darker truths in isolated families. In her experience, children who were described as weak or called home had often died from treatable conditions that proper medical care could have prevented. The compound itself told the story of 3 generations of increasing isolation. Ezra Whitlock had started with a simple farmhouse and 40 acres. His son had added the outbuildings and the first fence. But it was Martha and Sarah's father, Josiah, who had truly sealed them off from the world. The 12-foot fence, the razor wire, the boarded windows, all of these additions had come during his reign as the family patriarch. "Father taught us that mixing with outsiders weakens the spirit," Sarah said softly, speaking for the first time since they'd arrived. "Every contact with the corrupted world brings pollution to the soul. We are gardeners, tending to the pure stock that will repopulate the earth after the great cleansing." Chen had grown up hearing stories about families like the Whitlocks, mountain people who'd retreated so far from mainstream society that they'd created their own twisted version of reality. But she'd never encountered the genuine article, never seen the absolute certainty that could justify any action in the name of religious purity. The kitchen where they sat was a museum of self-sufficiency and paranoia. Mason jars filled with preserved vegetables lined handmade shelves. A wood-burning stove dominated one corner, its chimney pipe snaking through a hole cut in the wall. Everything was functional, austere, built to last without any dependence on the outside world. But it was the children's artwork that made Hayes's heart ache. Crayon drawings were tacked to the walls, pictures that should have shown houses and trees and stick-figure families playing in sunny yards. Instead, these drawings depicted walls and gates, shadowy figures huddled together in dark spaces. One particularly disturbing image showed what looked like a family tree. But all the figures had the same face, the same empty stare. "Where are the children now?" Chen asked, her patience wearing thin. Martha's eyes flashed with something between defiance and fear. "They are being prepared for your visit. Children raised in purity are not accustomed to the contamination that clings to outsiders. They must be cleansed and fortified before they can safely endure your presence." Through the thin walls, they could still hear voices, children talking in hushed tones that carried an odd formality, as if they were reciting lessons rather than playing games. The sound raised every protective instinct Hayes had developed in 30 years of child welfare work. "Mrs. Whitlock," she said firmly, "we need to see those children now." The anonymous letter had arrived at the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning in March, written in careful block letters on plain white paper. No return address, no signature, just 17 words that would change everything. "The Whitlock compound has children living in terrible conditions. Someone needs to help them before it's too late." Deputy Sheriff James Morrison had been the one to open it, and something about the deliberate handwriting had convinced him this wasn't another prank. The letter writer knew enough to be specific about the compound's location, mentioning the old logging road past Miller's Creek that only locals would recognize. More importantly, they'd used the word compound rather than farm or house, suggesting someone who understood the true nature of the Whitlock property. Judge Patricia Williamson had required 3 days of legal maneuvering before she'd signed the warrant. The Whitlocks had been hermits for decades, but being strange wasn't illegal. The county had learned to be cautious about interfering with mountain families, especially those with religious justifications for their isolation. Too many lawsuits had taught them that good intentions weren't always enough to protect them from legal challenges. But the letter had provided just enough specific detail to meet the legal threshold. Someone had seen children through gaps in the fence, children who appeared malnourished and dressed in homemade clothes that looked more like sackcloth than proper garments. The anonymous writer claimed to have witnessed what looked like a religious ceremony where children were made to kneel in the dirt while the sisters spoke in tongues above them. Now, standing in the compound's kitchen with Martha Whitlock's pale eyes boring into her, Detective Chen understood why someone had been moved to write that letter. The atmosphere in this place felt thick with secrets, heavy with the weight of things that should never have been allowed to continue for so long. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time," Chen said, her hand resting on her radio. "Where are the children?" Martha's response was to turn and walk toward the back door, her movements sharp and purposeful. "If you insist on this violation of our sacred space, then you will see what you have wrought. But know that their innocence will be stained by your presence, their purity compromised by contact with your corrupt world." The backyard was a maze of makeshift structures and vegetable gardens. Chicken coops built from scrap lumber housed a flock of scrawny birds that scattered as the women approached. A smokehouse stood next to what looked like a primitive laundry area, complete with washboards and lines strung between wooden posts. But it was the largest outbuilding that drew their attention. Unlike the ramshackle construction of the other structures, this building had been reinforced with extra boards and fitted with multiple padlocks. Small windows near the roofline had been covered with what looked like blackened paint. Blocking any view of the interior, Sarah hurried ahead of them. producing a ring of keys from somewhere in her voluminous dress. Her hands shook as she worked through the locks, and she kept glancing back at her sister as if seeking permission or guidance. "They are not accustomed to strangers," Sarah murmured as she struggled with the final lock. "Please understand, they know only the life we have provided. The outside world is foreign to them, frightening. They have been taught that outsiders bring contamination and sin." The door swung open on rusted hinges, and the smell that emerged made Hayes cover her nose with her hand. It was the odor of too many people living in too small a space, without adequate ventilation or sanitation. Unwashed bodies, soiled clothing, and something else that might have been fear itself, but it was the silence that truly disturbed them. As their eyes adjusted to the dim interior, they could make out small forms huddled against the far wall. Children, ranging from what looked like toddlers to teenagers, all pressed together like frightened animals. Their clothes were indeed homemade, rough brown fabric that matched Martha's dress, and their hair had been cut in the same severe style, regardless of gender. 12 pairs of pale blue eyes stared back at them, and not one of the children made a sound. They had learned, through methods Chen didn't want to imagine, that silence was the safest response to any unexpected situation. Their faces showed the hollow cheeks and sunken eyes of chronic malnutrition. But worse than their physical condition was the absolute stillness of their posture, the way they held themselves like creatures expecting punishment. "Dear God," Hayes whispered. And at the sound of her voice, the smallest children pressed even closer to their older siblings, seeking protection that could only come from each other. Dr. Rebecca Martinez had seen every form of child neglect in her 20 years as a pediatrician, but the 12 children brought in from the Whitlock compound challenged everything she thought she knew about human resilience. They sat in the hospital examination rooms like small ghosts, their pale eyes tracking every movement but never making direct contact with the adults trying to help them. The oldest appeared to be around 16, a girl whose stunted growth made her look years younger. She held the hand of what seemed to be her younger brother, a boy of perhaps 14, whose left arm hung at an odd angle, suggesting an old break that had never been properly set. The youngest was a toddler who couldn't have been more than 3, though malnutrition made it difficult to judge ages accurately. "They don't respond to their names," Dr. Martinez explained to Detective Chen as they watched through the observation window. "When we ask direct questions, they look to the oldest girl as if seeking permission to speak. It's like they've been trained to function as a single unit rather than as individuals." The teaching materials found in their living quarters told a disturbing story of isolation and indoctrination. Instead of proper textbooks, the children had learned from handwritten lessons that Sarah Whitlock had copied onto brown paper. The arithmetic problems all dealt with calculating food rations and dividing resources among the faithful. The geography lessons consisted entirely of biblical locations, with no mention of the modern world beyond their gates. History, as taught in the compound, began and ended with the Whitlock family's arrival in Kentucky. According to these crude educational materials, the outside world had fallen into corruption sometime around 1950, and only the pure bloodline, preserved within their walls, maintained God's true teachings. The children had been taught that they were the remnant, the chosen few who would inherit the earth after the coming judgment. But perhaps most disturbing were the science lessons that attempted to justify the sisters' breeding practices. Sarah had carefully copied charts showing how certain traits could be preserved through selective breeding, comparing human reproduction to the careful cultivation of prize livestock. The children had been taught that genetic diversity was a form of contamination, that mixing with outsiders would weaken their spiritual and physical purity. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, holding up a piece of brown paper covered in Sarah's careful handwriting. "It's a family tree, but it's also a breeding chart. They've been tracking which children are the offspring of which siblings, planning future pairings to maintain what they call bloodline integrity." The physical examinations revealed the cost of this ideology. 7 of the 12 children showed signs of genetic disorders commonly associated with inbreeding. Cleft palates, heart murmurs, developmental delays, and vision problems were rampant among the group. The 16-year-old girl had never menstruated, her reproductive system underdeveloped in ways that suggested serious hormonal imbalances. Most heartbreaking was their complete lack of knowledge about the world beyond their compound. When shown pictures of cars, airplanes, or modern buildings, the children reacted with fear rather than curiosity. They had been taught that such images were representations of the corrupted world, tools of Satan, designed to tempt the faithful away from righteousness. They've never seen a television, never heard a radio, never even seen a photograph of a city, the child psychologist reported. Their entire frame of reference consists of the compound, the Bible, and the distorted lessons the sisters taught them. They don't know what a school is, what a hospital is, or why we're trying to help them. The oldest girl, who the others called Sister Mary, in the formal manner they'd been taught to address each other, had taken on the role of protector and translator. When the younger children became frightened, she would whisper to them in what sounded like biblical verses, calming them with familiar words from their restricted world. She's been taught to see herself as a mother figure, Dr. Martinez observed, but she's also clearly been prepared for breeding purposes. The sisters have been giving her what they call purity lessons, teaching her that her primary value lies in producing the next generation of genetically isolated children. Chen watched the girl through the window, noting how she arranged the smaller children around her like a protective barrier. Even in this sterile hospital environment, surrounded by people trying to help, the children maintained the defensive postures they'd learned in their years of captivity. "How long do you think it will take?" Chen asked, "for them to understand that they're safe now?" Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. "Some of them may never fully understand. When isolation is this complete, when the indoctrination runs this deep, the psychological scars can last a lifetime. We're not just dealing with neglect here. We're dealing with children who have been systematically programmed to fear the very world we're trying to introduce them to." The journal pages were hidden beneath Martha's mattress, written in the same careful script that had filled the children's educational materials. District Attorney Carol Hendricks spread them across the conference table as the investigation team gathered for their morning briefing. Each page revealed another layer of the twisted ideology that had governed life within the compound for over 2 decades. "Listen to this," Hendricks said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Entry dated 15 years ago. The Lord has blessed us with another pure vessel. The child born to Mary and Joseph shows no signs of contamination from the outside world. His features are strong, his bloodline untainted. Sarah believes he will be suitable for breeding purposes when he reaches maturity. We must be patient and allow God's plan to unfold according to his divine timing." Detective Chen felt her stomach turn as she realized the implications. Mary and Joseph weren't biblical figures in Martha's writings. They were the names given to 2 of the children who had been forced into reproduction while still teenagers themselves. The clinical language made it sound like livestock breeding rather than human relationships. Public defender Lisa Walsh sat across from them, preparing for what she already knew would be the most challenging case of her career. "My clients maintain that everything they did was motivated by religious conviction. Martha insists that they were following biblical commandments to keep the bloodline pure, that modern society's acceptance of genetic mixing is contrary to God's will." The interrogation videos played on a loop in the background, showing Martha's unwavering certainty even in the face of mounting evidence. She sat ramrod straight in the metal chair, her pale eyes blazing with the same righteous fire she'd displayed at the compound. When confronted with medical evidence of the children's genetic disorders, she'd simply responded that God tests the faithful through adversity. Sarah's interviews painted a different picture. Where Martha burned with conviction, Sarah seemed to float in a dreamlike state of religious ecstasy. She spoke in riddles and parables, claiming that the voices of angels had guided their decisions. When pressed about specific incidents of abuse, she would begin reciting scripture, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of someone accustomed to speaking in tongues. The community knew, Chen said, spreading out witness statements across the table. Maybe not the full extent, but they knew something wasn't right. Mrs. Patterson from the general store has been taking their grocery orders for 20 years. She knew they were buying enough food for a dozen people, but she never asked questions. Tom Bradley, the propane delivery driver, had provided the most damning testimony. He'd heard children's voices for years, voices that sounded wrong somehow, too formal and fearful for normal kids. But like everyone else in the rural community, he'd chosen to mind his own business rather than risk confronting the Whitlock sisters' notorious tempers. "There's something else," Hayes said, pulling out a folder marked with red tape. "The medical examiner found evidence that not all of the children born in that compound survived. We've identified at least 3 graves in the back area of the property, small graves that the sisters claim hold children called home by the Lord." The children themselves remained the most difficult witnesses. Placed in emergency foster care throughout the county, they struggled to adapt to normal family life. Simple things like electric lights, running water, and prepared meals seemed to terrify them. The foster families reported that the children would often huddle together, whispering in the formal biblical language they'd been taught, as if normal childhood was a foreign concept. "The oldest girl, Mary, she's starting to open up a little," reported Dr. Emily Thompson, the child psychologist assigned to the case. But her understanding of family relationships is completely skewed. She refers to her own children as her sacred duty, rather than using words like love or affection. She was taught that reproduction was a religious obligation, not a choice or expression of caring. The legal challenges were mounting daily. Civil rights groups argued that the children had been denied basic education and medical care. Religious freedom advocates claimed that the state was persecuting the sisters for their unconventional beliefs. Media attention was growing, with reporters camping outside the courthouse and demanding access to information about what they were already calling the Kentucky compound case. "Martha's not backing down," Walsh reported after her latest client meeting. "Martha, she insists that we're all agents of Satan, that this prosecution is exactly the kind of persecution that proves their isolation was necessary. She wants to represent herself at trial, claims that no lawyer contaminated by worldly education could properly defend God's chosen servants." Judge Williamson was already struggling with preliminary motions. The sisters had requested separate trials, with Sarah's attorney arguing diminished capacity due to a lifetime of psychological manipulation by her older, more dominant sister. But Martha refused any suggestion that she was mentally incompetent, insisting that her actions had been guided by divine revelation rather than mental illness. The medical records were hidden in a wooden crate beneath the basement floor, wrapped in oilcloth and stored like buried treasure. Crime scene technician David Park had found them during the 3rd sweep of the compound, tucked away behind a false wall that had been cleverly concealed behind stacks of canned goods. Each document told a story of calculated breeding that spanned more than 2 decades. Martha had kept meticulous records of every pregnancy, every birth, every pairing she had orchestrated within the compound's walls. The handwritten charts read like livestock breeding logs, tracking genetic traits and planning future combinations with the cold efficiency of a scientist conducting experiments. But these weren't experiments on animals. They were deliberate manipulations of children's lives. "Look at this," Dr. Martinez said, holding up a chart that showed the genetic lineage of all 12 children. "She's tracked which children were born from which sibling pairings, and she's already planning the next generation." The oldest girl, Mary, was designated for breeding with her own brother Joseph when she turned 16. The records showed that Martha had served as midwife for every birth in the compound, delivering babies with nothing more than boiled water and prayers. Her notes detailed which infants showed promise and which displayed what she called weakness. The children who failed to meet her standards were described in increasingly clinical terms, as if their humanity diminished along with their perceived genetic value. Sarah's role had been equally disturbing but different in nature. While Martha handled the practical aspects of their breeding program, Sarah had been responsible for the spiritual justification. Her records, written in flowing script filled with biblical quotes, documented elaborate ceremonies designed to sanctify each pairing. She had convinced herself, and apparently the children, that their reproductive duties were sacred obligations rather than abuse. She calls it divine husbandry. District Attorney Hendricks read from one of Sarah's journals. According to her writings, God spoke to her directly about which children should be paired together. She believed that by keeping the bloodline pure, they were preserving humanity's spiritual essence for the post-apocalyptic world. The basement itself had been converted into a makeshift medical facility, complete with a delivery table made from scrap lumber and surgical instruments that looked like they'd been improvised from kitchen utensils. Jars of herbs lined wooden shelves. Martha's attempt at creating natural remedies for complications she wasn't equipped to handle. The smell of old blood and disinfectant still lingered in the cramped space. Most disturbing were the photographs Martha had taken to document each birth. Black and white images showed newborns being weighed on a crude scale, their vital statistics recorded in the margins like prize livestock. Some photos showed obvious birth defects, genetic abnormalities that Martha had noted with the same clinical detachment she applied to everything else. There are records here for at least 18 births, Park reported as he continued cataloguing the evidence. But we've only found 12 living children. The discrepancy raises questions about what happened to the others. Dr. Martinez studied the medical notes with growing horror. Martha had attempted to treat genetic disorders and birth complications using methods that belonged in the 19th century rather than the modern era. Cleft palates had been corrected with homemade devices that probably caused more harm than healing. Heart murmurs had been treated with herbal concoctions that had no medical value whatsoever. She was playing God, Chen said, watching the evidence technicians photograph each document. She decided which children were worthy of life, which ones deserved medical attention, which ones should reproduce. And she convinced herself it was all divine will. The breeding schedule found among the papers showed that Martha had planned pairings years in advance. Children as young as 12 had been designated for reproductive duties, their entire futures mapped out according to genetic charts that prioritize bloodline purity over their well-being or consent. The clinical language masked the reality of child sexual abuse systematically planned and executed under the guise of religious duty. Sarah's spiritual records added another layer of horror to the discovery. She had created elaborate rituals around each planned pairing, complete with biblical justifications for what amounted to organized incest. Her writings described purification ceremonies, where children were prepared for their reproductive duties through prayer, fasting, and what she called spiritual cleansing. They didn't see these children as human beings, Dr. Thompson observed after reviewing the psychological profiles compiled from the medical records. They saw them as vessels for preserving some imagined genetic purity. Every aspect of these kids' lives was controlled, planned, and manipulated to serve the sisters' twisted vision of divine purpose. The evidence painted a picture of systematic abuse that had continued for decades, hidden behind walls of religious fanaticism and community indifference. Martha and Sarah had created their own twisted version of paradise, where children existed solely to serve their vision of genetic and spiritual purity. The wedding ring had belonged to Martha and Sarah's grandmother, a thin band of tarnished gold that had passed from mother to daughter for 3 generations. Found in Martha's jewelry box alongside faded photographs and brittle documents, the ring told a story that reached back to the compound's founding in 1924. Each generation of Whitlock women had worn it, and each had used it to justify the continuation of practices that grew more twisted with every passing decade. Genealogist Rebecca Foster spread the family documents across the library table, tracing the Whitlock lineage back to its origins in rural Tennessee. What she found painted a disturbing picture of generational trauma that had metastasized into something unrecognizable as normal human behavior. The isolation started with religious conviction. Foster explained to the legal team, Martha's great-grandfather, Josiah Whitlock Sr., was a fundamentalist preacher who believed that mixing with other communities would contaminate his family's spiritual purity. But what began as religious separatism gradually evolved into something much more sinister. The early Whitlock marriages had been arranged within their small religious community, unions between cousins that were unusual but not unprecedented in rural Appalachian culture. But as the family became more isolated, the gene pool had shrunk to dangerous levels. By the time Martha and Sarah's parents came of age, they were already the product of multiple generations of intermarriage. Dr. Martinez had been studying the genetic profiles of all three generations, looking for patterns that might explain the severe developmental issues plaguing the current children. The accumulation of genetic problems isn't just coincidence, she reported. Each generation has amplified the effects of recessive genes. What started as minor issues, things like poor eyesight or slight hearing loss, have become major developmental disabilities. The therapy sessions with the children had begun to reveal the psychological infrastructure that had supported the compound's breeding program. Mary, the 16-year-old who served as the group's unofficial leader, had been taught that her role as a reproductive vessel was not just normal, but sacred. She spoke about pregnancy and childbirth, with the detached vocabulary of someone who had never been allowed to think of these experiences as personal choices. She refers to her own children as offerings to the bloodline, Dr. Thompson reported. When I ask her about feelings, about love or attachment, she looks confused. Those concepts weren't part of her education. She was taught that emotional connections were selfish distractions from her divine purpose. The compound's isolation had created a closed loop of trauma that passed from generation to generation, like a genetic disorder. Martha and Sarah had been raised by parents who were themselves the product of inbreeding and psychological manipulation. Their father, Ezra Whitlock, had been known in the community as a man whose religious fervor bordered on mental illness, given to violent outbursts and claims of direct communication with God. The neighbors remember him, Chen said, reviewing old police reports. Ezra was arrested 3 times in the 1960s for threatening behavior toward anyone who came near his property. But the charges were always dropped because the community didn't want to get involved. They figured it was easier to let the Whitlocks keep to themselves than deal with the problems that came with intervention. Martha's own childhood had been marked by the same isolation and indoctrination that she later imposed on the compound children. Old medical records found in the county health department archives showed that both sisters had been born with genetic abnormalities that were never properly treated. Martha had suffered from a cleft palate that was crudely repaired by her father, using techniques he'd learned from veterinary manuals. Sarah's developmental delays had been more severe, affecting her cognitive abilities in ways that made her particularly susceptible to her older sister's religious manipulation. Psychology reports from their brief enrollment in public school, before their father pulled them out permanently, described Sarah as childlike in her reasoning and unusually dependent on her sister for guidance. What we're seeing is a family system that has been breeding its own victims for nearly a century, Dr. Thompson concluded. Martha and Sarah aren't just perpetrators. They're also products of the same system they've now imposed on their own children. The trauma has become so embedded in the family structure that they genuinely can't see it as abnormal. The grandmother's wedding ring had been worn by women who had each contributed to this cycle of abuse, passing down not just jewelry, but a legacy of isolation, control, and genetic manipulation. Each generation had built higher walls, both physical and psychological, until the outside world had become not just foreign, but terrifying. The compound's children were now the fourth generation to suffer under this system, but they were also the first to be removed from it. Whether they could break the cycle that had consumed their family for nearly a century remained to be seen. The hand-drawn map was tucked inside an old mason jar, buried 3 feet beneath the compound's root cellar floor. Crime scene technician David Park had almost missed it, thinking the jar contained preserved vegetables like dozens of others scattered throughout the property. But when he unscrewed the rusted lid, he found something that made his blood run cold. A detailed layout of the compound, showing hidden spaces that hadn't appeared on any official survey. The map revealed a network of underground chambers and concealed rooms that the sisters had constructed over decades of paranoid preparation. What the investigation team had initially thought was a simple case of child neglect was beginning to look like something far more sinister and methodical. There's a whole section beneath the main house that we haven't accessed, Park reported to Detective Chen as they studied the crude drawings. According to this map, there are at least 3 chambers connected by tunnels, plus what looks like a separate storage area marked with symbols I don't recognize. The symbols scattered across the map looked like a mixture of Christian iconography and something else entirely. Crosses were interwoven with geometric patterns that might have been the sisters' own creation, a visual language developed during their decades of isolation. Some areas were marked with what appeared to be biblical references, while others bore notations in a code that would require expert analysis to decipher. Entering the hidden spaces required careful planning. The compound's main floor had been built to conceal the basement entrances, with trapdoors hidden beneath furniture and false walls that blended seamlessly with the original construction. It was clear that the sisters had been preparing for some kind of siege or investigation, creating bolt holes and hiding places that could conceal evidence or people. The first chamber they accessed was filled with religious artifacts that belonged in a museum rather than a family home. Hand-carved wooden crosses dominated the space, some reaching nearly to the ceiling and covered with inscriptions in what appeared to be Latin mixed with English biblical verses. Dozens of handmade candles had been arranged around a crude altar. Their wax pooled and hardened from years of religious ceremonies, but it was the second chamber that revealed the true scope of the sisters' delusions. The walls were covered with murals depicting scenes that the sisters apparently believed represented the future state of humanity. Pale-eyed figures in brown robes tended gardens, while dark-skinned people knelt in submission at their feet. The imagery was both racist and apocalyptic, showing the sisters' vision of a world where their pure bloodline had inherited dominion over all other races. They weren't just isolating themselves, Dr. Thompson observed as she studied the murals. They were preparing for some kind of racial holy war. These images suggest they believed their inbred children would eventually emerge to rule over a purified world. The third chamber was the most disturbing of all. It contained what could only be described as a shrine to genetic purity, with charts and diagrams covering every available surface. The sisters had been tracking not just their own family's breeding patterns, but those of neighboring families as well, apparently planning for some future expansion of their program. Small graves were marked on the map with simple crosses, confirming the investigators' suspicions that not all children born in the compound had survived. The burial sites were scattered throughout the property, some in the vegetable gardens where their decomposition could serve as fertilizer, others in more remote areas that would be harder for outsiders to discover. There are at least 8 burial sites marked on this map, Chen counted grimly. If each one represents a child who died in the compound, we're looking at a mortality rate that would make this place a death camp rather than a family home. The sisters had also prepared for the possibility of discovery, creating escape routes and hidden caches of supplies that would allow them to disappear into the surrounding mountains if authorities ever came looking. The map showed bolt holes stocked with food, weapons and cash, evidence of paranoia that had been building for decades. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery of detailed surveillance notes about their neighbors, community leaders and local officials. The sisters had been watching the outside world far more carefully than anyone realized, gathering intelligence about who might pose a threat to their operation and planning countermeasures accordingly. They had files on the sheriff, the mayor, even the local ministers, Hayes reported as she catalogued the evidence. These women weren't just religious fanatics living in isolation. They were running a sophisticated operation designed to maintain their control over those children while staying hidden from authorities. The compound's layout revealed a level of planning and preparation that spoke to the sisters' intelligence, even as their goals remained utterly twisted. They had created a fortress designed to protect their vision of genetic purity, complete with hidden chambers, escape routes, and burial grounds for those who failed to meet their standards. The birth certificate fragment was found in Martha's fireplace, half burned and brittle with age, but still legible enough to stop Detective Chen's heart. The name at the top read Daniel Whitlock, with a birth date that would make him 24 years old if he was still alive. But according to every record they'd found, every child account Martha and Sarah had provided, there were only 12 children in the compound. Chen held the fragment up to the light, trying to make out the faded details. The mother's name was listed as Mary Whitlock, the same Mary who was now 16 and serving as the group's protective leader. But the father's name had been deliberately obscured, burned away in what appeared to be an intentional attempt to destroy evidence. There was a 13th child, she announced to the investigation team. Someone we haven't accounted for, someone who was born in that compound but isn't with the other children. The revelation sent shockwaves through the legal proceedings. Martha's carefully constructed narrative about protecting her 12 sacred charges suddenly had a massive hole in it. When confronted with the birth certificate during her next interrogation, her reaction was swift and violent. She lunged across the table at Detective Chen, her face contorted with a rage that went beyond religious fanaticism into something approaching genuine madness. "You know nothing about the trials we faced," Martha screamed as the guards restrained her. "Nothing about the sacrifices required to maintain purity in this corrupted world. Some vessels prove unworthy, some bloodlines must be corrected." The implications of her words were chilling. Had Daniel been murdered because he failed to meet the sisters' genetic standards? Had he escaped and been living in hiding for years? Or was there another explanation that the investigation hadn't yet uncovered? Sarah's reaction to questions about Daniel was entirely different. When shown the birth certificate, she began weeping uncontrollably, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from some deep well of suppressed grief. And like Martha's explosive anger, Sarah's response suggested genuine loss and regret. "He was beautiful," Sarah whispered through her tears. "Perfect in every way." But Martha said he carried the taint, that his questions would contaminate the others. "I tried to protect him, tried to hide him, but Martha always found out everything." Dr. Thompson worked with Sarah over several sessions, trying to extract coherent information about Daniel's fate without triggering complete psychological collapse. What emerged was a story of a child who had been different from the others, more curious about the outside world, more resistant to the sisters' rigid control. According to Sarah, Daniel started asking questions when he was around 12, Dr. Thompson reported. Questions about why they couldn't leave the compound, why the other children looked so similar, why they never saw other people. Martha viewed his curiosity as a form of spiritual rebellion that could spread to the others. The search for Daniel became the investigation's top priority. If he had escaped the compound, he might be the key witness who could provide first-hand testimony about life under the sisters' control. But if he had been killed, his fate would elevate the charges from child abuse to murder. County records showed no trace of Daniel Whitlock in any school system, medical facility, or social service program. He had existed only within the compound's walls, invisible to the outside world, just like his siblings. But unlike them, he had somehow vanished from even the sisters' meticulous records. Martha destroyed most references to him, forensic accountant Jennifer Walsh reported after analyzing the compound's documents. But she missed a few things. There are grocery receipts that show purchases for 13 people, medical supplies that suggest someone was treated for injuries, and wear patterns in the clothing that indicate another person living in the household. The psychological profiles of the other children began to make more sense in light of Daniel's existence. Several of them, particularly the older ones, showed signs of trauma that went beyond the general abuse they'd all suffered. They flinched when asked certain questions, became agitated when shown photographs of young men, and demonstrated the kind of hypervigilance associated with witnessing violence. They remember him, Dr. Thompson concluded, and they remember what happened to him. But they're too terrified to talk about it directly. The fear Martha instilled in them about outsiders pales compared to their terror of what she might do to them if they reveal family secrets. The birth certificate fragment represented more than just evidence of another child. It was proof that Martha's control over the compound had been absolute, that she had the power to erase people from existence when they threatened her vision of genetic purity. Daniel Whitlock had become a ghost, existing only in burned documents and the traumatic memories of his siblings. The church records were kept in a dusty filing cabinet in the basement of Millerville Baptist Church, yellowed pages that documented 70 years of births, deaths and marriages in the rural community. Pastor William Crawford had been reluctant to share them, citing privacy concerns, but a court order had convinced him that cooperation was in everyone's best interest. What Detective Chen found in those records painted a disturbing picture of community complicity that stretched back decades. The Whitlock family hadn't been as isolated as they'd claimed. They had maintained connections with certain members of the religious community, connections that had provided them with protection and resources while their compound operated in secrecy. "Look at this," Chen said, pointing to an entry from 1985. Martha and Sarah were regular attendees at revival meetings until the early 1990s. Pastor Crawford's predecessor, Reverend Thomas Mitchell, even performed blessing ceremonies for what he called the sacred unions of the faithful. The implications were staggering. Reverend Mitchell had known about the sisters' breeding program and had provided religious sanction for what amounted to organized child sexual abuse. His sermon notes, preserved in the church archives, contained references to preserving the purity of God's chosen people and the divine wisdom of selective breeding among the righteous. County Commissioner Harold Brennan's name appeared repeatedly in the records, along with notations about special dispensations and protective measures for the faithful community. Brennan had been in office for 35 years, long enough to have influenced multiple investigations into the Whitlock compound. Every time a concerned citizen had filed a complaint, every time a social worker had tried to investigate reports of neglect, the case had somehow been buried in bureaucratic red tape. Brennan was taking money from them, forensic accountant Jennifer Walsh discovered after analyzing financial records seized from the commissioner's office. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger federal attention, but consistent payments over decades. The sisters were buying protection from the very officials who should have been investigating them. Dr. Patterson, the local physician who had served the community for 40 years, had also been aware of the situation. His medical record showed that he had treated Martha and Sarah for various injuries and illnesses, but he had never reported the obvious signs of genetic disorders that would have indicated inbreeding in their family line. He had to know, Dr. Martinez said after reviewing Patterson's files. The sisters showed classic markers of genetic abnormalities, and their requests for prenatal vitamins and birthing supplies would have made it obvious that children were being born in the compound. But he never filed a single report with Child Protective Services. The conspiracy of silence had been maintained through a combination of religious fanaticism, financial incentives, and simple cowardice. The Whitlock sisters had cultivated relationships with community leaders who shared their fundamentalist beliefs or who could be bought with modest payments and promises of future consideration. Sheriff Bradley Morrison, James Morrison's father, had received regular donations to the Police Benevolent Fund from an account controlled by the sisters. His incident reports showed multiple calls to the compound over the years, but each investigation had been cursory and quickly closed. The current sheriff's discovery of this corruption had prompted his immediate resignation and cooperation with federal investigators. The whole system was designed to protect them, District Attorney Hendricks said as she reviewed the evidence of official misconduct. Every institution that should have been protecting those children had been compromised or intimidated into silence. The most damaging evidence came from the personal correspondence found in Reverend Mitchell's effects after his death in 2018. Letters between the pastor and Martha Whitlock revealed detailed discussions about the theological justifications for their breeding program, complete with biblical citations and references to maintaining racial purity in preparation for the end times. They believed they were creating a master race. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos explained as she briefed the expanded investigation team, not just genetic purity, but racial purity. The correspondence shows that they viewed their inbred children as the foundation for a white supremacist society that would emerge after what they called the Great Cleansing. The community's willful blindness had enabled decades of systematic abuse. Neighbors had heard strange sounds, seen suspicious activities, and noticed the absence of children in a household that clearly supported a large family. But fear, prejudice, and financial self-interest had kept them silent while 12 children suffered in isolation. Every adult in this community who knew and did nothing is complicit, Jen said as she studied the web of corruption and cowardice that had protected the compound. The sisters couldn't have maintained this operation without help from people who should have been protecting children instead of enabling their abuse. The church records were just the beginning. Federal investigators were now examining decades of county government decisions, medical records, and financial transactions that had allowed the Whitlock compound to operate as a closed system of abuse while maintaining the appearance of religious isolation. The hospital visitor log from Mercy General in Louisville had been sitting in storage for 8 years, a routine record that should have been discarded according to standard retention policies. But when FBI agent Santos requested a search of all medical facilities within a 100-mile radius of the compound, the log became a crucial piece of evidence in the hunt for Daniel Whitlock. The entry was brief but unmistakable. D. Miller, age 16, treated for severe malnutrition and infected wounds. No insurance, cash payment, refused follow-up care. The date was June 15, 2016, exactly 8 years ago. The attending physician's notes described injuries consistent with prolonged physical abuse and signs of genetic disorders associated with inbreeding. Miller was likely an assumed name, Agent Santos explained to the investigation team. The address given was false and the phone number was disconnected. But the medical description matches what we'd expect from someone who escaped the compound after years of abuse. Dr. Lisa Chen, who had treated the mysterious patient, remembered the case clearly despite the passage of time. The young man had been brought to the emergency room by a woman who claimed to be his aunt, though she'd refused to provide identification or contact information. The injuries were severe enough to suggest long-term abuse, but both the patient and his companion had been adamant about avoiding any contact with authorities. He was terrified, Dr. Chen recalled, not just of the medical procedures, but of being in the hospital at all. He kept asking if we were going to call the police, if someone would make him go back home. The woman with him seemed genuinely concerned for his welfare, but she was also clearly helping him hide from something. The description of the mysterious woman sent a chill through Detective Chen. Middle-aged, wearing simple clothes, driving an older pickup truck with Kentucky plates. It matched the general appearance of several women in the local community. But one name kept coming up in witness interviews: Janet Morrison, the wife of former Sheriff Bradley Morrison. Janet Morrison had been a school nurse for 30 years before retiring in 2015. Her medical training and access to supplies would have made her capable of providing initial treatment for Daniel's injuries. More importantly, her husband's position in law enforcement would have given her inside knowledge about the compound and the corruption that protected it. When confronted with the hospital records, Janet Morrison broke down completely. Through tears, she admitted to helping Daniel escape from the compound after witnessing what she described as preparations for his execution. She had been delivering medical supplies to the compound under the guise of charitable work when she discovered that Martha intended to kill Daniel for what she called contamination of the bloodline. He had started asking questions about the outside world. Janet explained during her videotaped confession, questions about school, about other families, about why he and his siblings all looked so similar. Martha viewed his curiosity as a spiritual cancer that would spread to the other children if it wasn't eliminated. Janet's testimony revealed that Daniel's escape had been planned over several months. She had gradually gained his trust during her visits to the compound, slipping him information about the outside world and helping him understand that life beyond the gates was possible. The night of his escape, she had hidden outside the compound until he could slip away during one of the sisters' prayer sessions. "I couldn't save all of them," Janet sobbed. "But I thought if I could save just one, if I could get him to safety, maybe he could eventually help the others. I gave him enough money to get to Louisville, told him to find a job and try to build a normal life. The hospital records showed that Daniel had been treated for multiple fractures, some recent and others that had healed improperly years earlier. Scars on his back suggested repeated beatings with leather straps or similar implements. Most disturbing were the infected wounds around his ankles and wrists, evidence that he had been restrained for extended periods. Martha had been keeping him chained in the basement," Janet continued. "She said he was too dangerous to live with the other children, that his questions would corrupt their faith. She was planning to take him to one of the burial sites in the woods, claiming that God had called him home, just like the others who had disappointed her. The revelation that Daniel was alive and potentially living under an assumed identity in Louisville triggered a massive search effort. Police began checking employment records, apartment rentals, and social service programs for any trace of a young man matching his description. The fact that he had survived 8 years in the outside world suggested remarkable resilience, but it also raised questions about whether he would be willing to testify against the women who had shaped his childhood through systematic abuse. Daniel Miller walked into the FBI field office in Louisville on a Tuesday morning in October, 8 years after he'd last seen the inside of the Whitlock compound. The young man who approached Agent Santos bore the physical markers of his traumatic childhood, scars that told stories of violence and neglect. But his eyes held something that had been absent in his siblings: hope. At 24, Daniel had managed to build a life for himself in the city, working as a maintenance technician at a downtown office building and living in a modest apartment near the university. He'd learned to read and write through literacy programs at the public library, earned his GED through night classes, and slowly begun to understand that the world beyond the compound's gates wasn't the hellscape Martha and Sarah had described. "I've been following the news about the compound," Daniel said, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had taught himself to speak properly. "When I saw that the children had been found, I knew I had to come forward. They need someone to tell the truth about what really happened in that place." The scars on Daniel's arms and back told the story of Martha's escalating violence during his final years in the compound. Unlike his younger siblings, he had reached an age where he could question the sisters' absolute authority, and Martha had responded with increasing brutality. The infected wounds around his wrists and ankles, documented in the hospital records, were evidence of months spent chained in the basement whenever Martha decided he posed a threat to the others. She called it purification through suffering, Daniel explained, rolling up his sleeves to show the permanent marks left by metal restraints. "Whenever I asked questions about the outside world, whenever I suggested that maybe we could visit other people or go to school like normal children, she would say that Satan was speaking through me. The chains were supposed to give me time to pray and cleanse my spirit. Daniel's testimony provided the missing pieces that investigators had been searching for." He described the systematic breeding program in detail, explaining how Martha had paired siblings together as soon as they reached puberty, and how Sarah had created religious ceremonies to justify what everyone involved understood was sexual abuse. He spoke about the children who had died over the years, victims of genetic disorders, medical neglect, and Martha's violent punishments. "There were 18 of us born in that compound," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. 6 died before they reached their 5th birthday. 3 more were killed by Martha when they showed signs of what she called genetic weakness. "The children you found are the survivors, the ones who learned to be invisible enough to avoid her. Attention, the psychological evaluation conducted by Dr. Thompson revealed the remarkable resilience that had allowed Daniel to survive both his childhood trauma and 8 years of independent living, unlike his siblings, who had been completely isolated from the outside world. Daniel had managed to maintain a spark of curiosity that ultimately saved his life. He suffered from severe PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorders, Dr. Thompson reported. But he's also developed coping mechanisms and a sense of personal agency that his siblings lack. The fact that he questioned the sisters' authority, even knowing the consequences, suggests a psychological strength that wasn't completely broken by their abuse. Daniel's escape had been the result of months of careful planning with Janet Morrison's help. He had gradually collected information about the outside world, hidden supplies in the compound's outbuildings, and watched for opportunities to slip away undetected. The night of his escape, he had waited until Martha and Sarah were conducting one of their lengthy prayer sessions before cutting through a weak section of fence and disappearing into the surrounding woods. "I knew they would come looking for me," Daniel said. "Martha had killed other children who tried to resist her control, but I also knew that if I stayed, I would either die or become like them, completely broken and willing to do anything to avoid her anger. I chose to take the risk." The reunion between Daniel and his siblings was both heartbreaking and hopeful. The younger children barely remembered him, their memories of his existence suppressed by years of Martha's psychological manipulation. But the older ones, particularly Mary, recognized him immediately and broke down in tears at the sight of their lost brother. "They thought I was dead," Daniel said after spending several hours with his siblings. "Martha told them that I had been claimed by Satan, that speaking about me would bring the same fate upon them. But seeing me alive, seeing that someone can escape and survive in the outside world, maybe it will help them understand that recovery is possible." Daniel's return transformed the legal case against Martha and Sarah from child abuse to attempted murder, adding new dimensions to charges that were already among the most serious the county had ever prosecuted. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity on the morning Martha Whitlock finally broke. For 6 weeks of testimony, she had maintained her rigid posture and blazing certainty, dismissing witness after witness as corrupted agents of a fallen world. But when Daniel took the stand and began describing his years chained in the basement, something fundamental cracked in Martha's carefully constructed facade. The confession tape would become evidence in federal, civil rights investigations and training material for law enforcement agencies studying religious extremism. What it captured was the complete psychological collapse of a woman who had spent decades convincing herself that systematic child abuse was divine will. He was contaminated from birth, Martha said into the recording device, her voice flat and emotionless for the first time since her arrest. The bloodline was pure, but his spirit carried corruption. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at the world beyond our gates with longing instead of righteous fear. District Attorney Hendricks sat across from Martha in the small interrogation room, watching as the woman who had terrorized children for decades finally acknowledged the reality of her crimes. The transformation was startling. Gone was the righteous fury, the biblical rhetoric, the absolute certainty that had sustained her through months of legal proceedings. What remained was a hollow shell speaking truths that seemed to exhaust her with each word. The others who died, they were weak, Martha continued, staring at the table rather than meeting anyone's eyes. God calls home those who cannot serve his purpose. But Daniel, he was different. He questioned everything, corrupted the younger ones with his doubts. Sarah said we should pray for his redemption, but I knew he was beyond salvation. The details that emerged during Martha's confession painted a picture of calculated cruelty that went beyond anything investigators had imagined. She described selecting which children would be paired for breeding based on genetic charts she had drawn from veterinary manuals. She admitted to withholding medical care from children who showed signs of developmental disabilities, believing that their suffering was divine punishment for genetic impurity. Most chilling was her matter-of-fact description of the children who had been called home over the years. Martha had smothered 3 infants who were born with obvious genetic disorders, buried them in the compound's vegetable gardens, and told the other children that God had claimed them for heaven. 2 older children, who had shown signs of intellectual disabilities, had been locked in the root cellar during a winter cold snap and left to freeze to death. Sarah cried for them, Martha said, her voice carrying no emotion whatsoever. She never understood that weakness must be purged from the bloodline. God's chosen people cannot carry the burden of defective vessels. It was mercy, not murder. Sarah's testimony, delivered in a separate room with her own legal counsel, painted a different picture of the same events. Where Martha spoke with clinical detachment, Sarah wept uncontrollably as she described being forced to participate in what she knew were murders, but had been taught to view as religious obligations. Martha said, God spoke to her directly, Sarah sobbed. She said I was too weak to receive divine revelation, that I had to trust her judgment even when my heart told me something was wrong. When the children died, she said it was because I hadn't prayed hard enough, that my doubts had made God turn away from them. The psychological evaluation ordered by the court revealed that both sisters suffered from severe mental illness, exacerbated by decades of isolation and inbreeding. Martha showed signs of delusional disorder with religious themes, while Sarah exhibited symptoms consistent with dissociative identity disorder and chronic depression. But mental illness didn't excuse the systematic nature of their crimes, or the calculated way they had avoided detection for so long. They created their own reality. Dr. Thompson explained to the court during sentencing hearings, a closed system where abuse became religious duty, where murder became divine will, where the suffering of children became proof of spiritual purity. But they also demonstrated clear awareness that their actions were illegal. evidenced by their elaborate efforts to hide evidence and avoid detection. The public gallery was filled with members of the community who had maintained their silence for decades, watching as the full scope of their complicity was revealed through Martha's confession. Some wept openly as they heard details about children they could have saved if they had found the courage to act. Others sat in stony silence, perhaps finally understanding the consequences of their willful blindness. Martha's confession lasted 4 hours, covering every aspect of the compound's operation, from its religious justifications to its practical mechanics. When it was over, she looked up at District Attorney Hendricks for the first time and asked a question that would haunt everyone who heard it. Will the children forgive me when they understand that everything I did was for their eternal salvation? Judge Patricia Williamson had presided over criminal cases for 23 years, but nothing had prepared her for the moment when she sentenced Martha and Sarah Whitlock to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as she read the verdict, her voice steady despite the weight of delivering justice for crimes that had spanned decades and claimed the lives of 9 children. Martha received 6 consecutive life sentences for the murders of children she had deemed genetically unfit, plus additional decades for child abuse, sexual exploitation of minors, and conspiracy charges. Sarah, whose cooperation and evident mental breakdown had earned some consideration, received 3 life sentences with the possibility of parole after 30 years. At 61 and 59 respectively, neither sister would likely see freedom again. The foster care placement documents told stories of hope emerging from horror. 12 children, ranging in age from 3 to 16, were placed with carefully screened families throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. The separation was necessary to prevent the siblings from reinforcing the psychological patterns that had been drilled into them during their years of captivity, but social workers maintained contact between them to preserve the family bonds that had sustained them through their ordeal. Mary, the 16-year-old, who had served as protector for the younger children, was placed with the Henderson family in Lexington. Dr. Sarah Henderson was a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, and her husband Mark was a high school teacher with experience working with at-risk youth. Their first months together were challenging, as Mary struggled to understand that asking questions wouldn't result in punishment and that showing emotion was safe rather than dangerous. She keeps apologizing for taking up space. Dr. Henderson reported during one of the regular check-ins with social services. When we serve her food, she asks if she's taking too much. When she uses the bathroom, she thanks us for permission. It's going to take years to undo the psychological conditioning that taught her she had no inherent worth as a human being. The younger children showed different patterns of adaptation, some embracing their new freedom with remarkable resilience, while others retreated into protective shells that might take years to penetrate. The 3-year-old, placed with a family in Tennessee, had no memory of life outside the compound and adapted to normal childhood activities with surprising ease. But the older children carried scars that manifested in nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to trust adults who claimed to want what was best for them. Daniel's role in his siblings' recovery proved crucial. As the only one who had successfully escaped and built an independent life, he became a bridge between their traumatic past and the possibility of a normal future. He visited each of his siblings regularly, sharing stories about life in the outside world and demonstrating that survival beyond the compound's walls was not just possible, but rewarding. He shows them that they can have jobs, friends, and normal relationships, explained Dr. Thompson, who continued to coordinate psychological services for all the survivors. For children who were taught that the outside world was evil and corrupted, seeing their brother thriving in that world is more powerful than any therapy session. The compound itself was demolished 6 months after the trial concluded. its buildings reduced to rubble, and its grounds consecrated as a memorial garden. The community had voted unanimously to purchase the property from the state and transform it into a place of remembrance for the children who had died there and hope for those who had survived. A simple granite marker was placed at the center of the memorial garden, bearing the names of the 9 children who had lost their lives to Martha's twisted vision of genetic purity. Wildflowers were planted throughout the grounds, chosen specifically because they would spread and multiply naturally, creating beauty from the soil that had witnessed so much suffering. The broader community began the long process of reckoning with their complicity in the compound's crimes. County Commissioner Harold Brennan resigned in disgrace and faced federal charges for accepting bribes. Former Sheriff Bradley Morrison was stripped of his pension and barred from law enforcement. Dr. Patterson lost his medical license and faced civil lawsuits from the families of children who could have been saved if he had reported his suspicions. We all have to live with the knowledge that those children suffered because we chose to look the other way, said Pastor Crawford during a community healing service. We told ourselves it wasn't our business, that we couldn't interfere with someone else's religious beliefs. But silence in the face of evil is complicity. And we failed those children in ways that can never be fully forgiven. The school enrollment papers arrived at Jefferson County Public Schools on a crisp Monday morning in September, 2 years after the compound's discovery. Each document represented a small miracle. Children who had never seen the inside of a classroom were finally taking their first steps into the world of formal education. The paperwork told stories of remarkable progress and heartbreaking setbacks as 12 survivors worked to build normal lives from the ruins of their traumatic childhoods. Mary Whitlock, now 18 and legally free to choose her own name, had become Mary Henderson at her own request. She had completed her GED through intensive tutoring and was preparing to start community college classes in early childhood development. Her foster mother, Dr. Sarah Henderson, marveled at the young woman's determination to transform her experience as a victim into skills that could help other children. She wants to become a social worker. Dr. Henderson explained to the college admissions counselor. She says that someone who understands what it feels like to be powerless should be the one helping other powerless children. Her perspective on child welfare issues is unlike anything I've encountered in my professional career. The enrollment papers for the younger children revealed both progress and ongoing challenges. 8-year-old Matthew, who had never spoken to anyone outside his siblings during his years in the compound, was finally beginning to communicate with his teachers. His first-grade primer sat beside advanced mathematics worksheets, reflecting the uneven development that characterized all the survivors. They know things that children their age shouldn't know, and they don't know things that should be automatic, explained Linda Martinez, the special education coordinator assigned to work with the Whitlock children. Matthew can calculate complex ratios for food distribution because that's how he learned math in the compound. But he doesn't know how to tie his shoes or ride a bicycle because those skills weren't necessary for survival. Daniel had become an unofficial advocate for his siblings, attending school meetings and helping teachers understand the unique challenges faced by children who had been raised in complete isolation. His own educational journey continued as well, with night classes at the University of Louisville, where he was studying social work and psychology. People ask me how I survived, Daniel said during a presentation to social work students. But survival isn't the right word. Survival is what we did in the compound, staying quiet, staying invisible, doing whatever it took to avoid Martha's attention. What we're doing now is learning how to live. The medical treatments required by several of the children continued to address the genetic disorders caused by generations of inbreeding. 3 of the younger children had undergone surgery to correct cleft palates and heart defects that would have been fatal without intervention. Others received ongoing therapy for developmental delays and learning disabilities. that might never be completely overcome. The psychological healing proved even more complex than the physical recovery. Dr. Thompson's reports documented the intricate ways that trauma had shaped the children's understanding of basic concepts like safety, trust, and personal autonomy. Simple activities like choosing what to wear or what to eat for breakfast required extensive coaching because the children had never been allowed to make decisions for themselves. There, learning that their thoughts and feelings matter, Dr. Thompson noted in her quarterly assessment. For children who were taught that questioning authority was a sin, punishable by death, the concept of having personal preferences is revolutionary. We're not just treating trauma, we're teaching them how to be individuals rather than extensions of someone else's will. The foster families had received extensive training in trauma-informed care, but the reality of helping these children adapt to normal life proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Traditional parenting approaches often triggered panic responses in children who had been conditioned to expect punishment for the smallest infractions. We had to throw out everything we thought we knew about raising children, said Tom Bradley, who had fostered two of the younger boys. These kids don't respond to normal discipline because they were raised with the constant threat of violence. We've had to learn how to provide structure and boundaries while convincing them that making mistakes won't result in physical punishment. The school enrollment papers also documented the extraordinary resilience that had allowed these children to begin building new lives despite everything they had endured. Progress reports showed improvements in academic performance, social interaction, and emotional regulation that experts had initially thought might take decades to achieve. They're not just surviving, observed Principal Janet Morrison, no relation to the Janet Morrison who had helped Daniel escape. They're beginning to thrive. These children have a strength that comes from having endured the worst possible circumstances and discovered that better things are possible. The new county protocol manual was thick as a phone book, its pages detailing procedures that had been written in the blood of 9 dead children and the tears of 12 survivors. Deputy Chief Sandra Chen, promoted after her work on the Whitlock case, had spent 2 years developing guidelines that would ensure no family could again disappear into isolation while systematically abusing children. The manual's first chapter was titled Recognizing Isolation, Abuse, Warning Signs That Cannot Be Ignored. It included specific indicators that every social worker, law enforcement officer, and medical professional in the county was now required to memorize. Large grocery orders with no visible children. Medical supply purchases by families claiming religious exemptions from health care. Property modifications designed to prevent observation from neighbors or authorities. We created a culture of willful blindness, Chen explained to a conference of child protection specialists from across the region. Everyone knew something was wrong with the Whitlock compound, but we told ourselves it wasn't our business to interfere with religious families. The new protocols make it clear that isolation combined with suspicious behavior triggers mandatory investigation, regardless of religious claims. The legal reforms inspired by the case had already been adopted by 15 states, with federal legislation pending in Congress. The Whitlock Act would close loopholes that had allowed the sisters to avoid oversight by claiming religious exemptions for medical care and education. Children would still be protected under religious freedom laws, but parents could no longer use faith as a shield for systematic abuse. Judge Patricia Williamson had become a national advocate for these reforms, speaking at legal conferences about the failures that had enabled decades of abuse. Religious freedom is fundamental to our democracy, she said during her keynote address to the National Association of Family Court Judges. But it cannot be used as a license to torture and murder children. The law must protect the most vulnerable, even when their abusers claim divine authority. The county's Child Protective Services Department had been completely restructured, with new oversight mechanisms and mandatory reporting requirements that eliminated the bureaucratic dead ends that had buried previous complaints about the compound. Social workers now received annual training in recognizing signs of isolation abuse, and every case involving religious exemptions required review by a special panel of experts. Dr. Emily Thompson had established a new treatment center specifically designed for children rescued from extreme isolation or religious abuse. The Whitlock Center for Trauma Recovery provided specialized therapy for victims whose psychological conditioning required approaches that traditional mental health services weren't equipped to handle. These children need more than standard PTSD treatment. Dr. Thompson explained to the medical board that approved the center's certification. They need help learning how to be individuals, how to think for themselves, how to recognize that they have inherent value as human beings. Traditional therapy assumes a baseline understanding of personal autonomy that these children were never allowed to develop. The community education programs required by the new protocols reached into every corner of rural Kentucky, teaching neighbors, teachers, and business owners how to recognize signs of isolation abuse and understand their legal obligations to report suspicious behavior. The programs were named in honor of the anonymous tipster whose letter had finally triggered the investigation that saved 12 children's lives. Someone in this community had the courage to speak up when it mattered, said Margaret Hayes, who had been promoted to director of the county's child welfare programs. We don't know who wrote that letter, but we know it saved lives. The new education programs are designed to create a community where more people will have that courage when they see children in danger. The financial costs of implementing the new protocols were substantial, but the county had found unexpected sources of funding. Settlements from lawsuits against officials who had accepted bribes or ignored warning signs provided millions of dollars for enhanced child protection services. Federal grants supported the training programs and specialized treatment centers that were becoming models for other rural communities. The ongoing support systems for the Whitlock survivors had become a permanent part of the county's budget, ensuring that all 12 children would have access to medical care, psychological treatment, and educational support for as long as they needed it. Daniel had been hired as a consultant to help design services for other children rescued from similar situations. We learned that saving children from abuse is only the beginning, explained County Commissioner Jennifer Walsh, who had been elected to replace the disgraced Harold Brennan. Recovery takes years, sometimes decades. These children need support systems that will last as long as their healing process, and our community has committed to providing that support regardless of the cost. The new protocols had already proven their worth, identifying 3 other families in the region where children were being isolated and potentially abused. None of these cases involved the extreme conditions found at the Whitlock compound, but early intervention had prevented situations that could have escalated into tragedy. The memorial garden. Stone sat quietly among the wildflowers that had grown thick and vibrant in the 5 years since the compound's demolition. Carved from Kentucky limestone, it bore 13 names, 9 children who had lost their lives to Martha's twisted vision of genetic purity, and 4 more whose survival had inspired changes that would protect countless other children in the years to come. Daniel Whitlock stood before the memorial on a warm September morning, no longer the frightened 16-year-old who had escaped into the darkness 8 years earlier, but a confident social worker whose advocacy had helped reshape how America protects its most vulnerable children. At 29, he carried the physical scars of his childhood, but had transformed his trauma into a powerful force for justice. We gather here not just to remember the children who died, Daniel said to the small crowd assembled for the annual memorial service, but to honor the strength of those who survived and to renew our commitment to ensuring that no child ever again suffers what we endured. Mary Henderson, now 23 and recently graduated with her master's degree in social work, stood beside her brother with her own children. Twin boys, born healthy and free from the genetic disorders that had plagued their family for generations. Her decision to have children had been carefully considered, with extensive genetic counseling and prenatal care that ensured the cycle of inherited disabilities would end with her generation. "These boys will grow up knowing they have choices," Mary said, watching her sons play among the wildflowers. "They'll never know what it feels like to be told their only value lies in serving someone else's vision of perfection. They'll be individuals, not vessels for someone else's ideology." The other survivors had followed different paths toward healing and independence. Matthew, now 13 and thriving in 8th grade, had discovered a talent for music that had become his primary means of expression. His foster father, a music teacher, reported that Matthew could communicate through piano compositions in ways that words still sometimes failed him. Sarah Whitlock died in prison 3 years after her sentencing, her mental health never recovering from the collapse of the delusional system that had structured her entire adult life. Martha remained imprisoned in maximum security, refusing all visitors, and maintaining her conviction that she had been a servant of divine will rather than an architect of systematic abuse. Dr. Emily Thompson's research on isolation. Abuse had influenced child protection policies across the United States and internationally. The Whitlock case had become a cornerstone study in understanding how extreme religious beliefs could be weaponized to justify horrific crimes against children. What we learned from this case is that isolation is often the first step towards systematic abuse. Dr. Thompson explained during her presentation to the International Conference on Child Protection. When families cut themselves off from outside oversight, when they claim religious exemptions from basic standards of care, when they view their children as property rather than individuals, we must intervene before tragedy occurs. The anonymous letter writer who had triggered the investigation had never been identified, despite extensive efforts by law enforcement and journalists. The mystery person had become a symbol of the moral courage required to protect children, proof that a single act of conscience could save lives and inspire systemic change. The wildflowers that grew throughout the memorial garden had been chosen for their ability to spread and multiply, creating new beauty from the soil that had witnessed so much suffering. Each spring brought new blooms, a living reminder that life could triumph over death, hope over despair, love over the twisted ideology that had claimed so many young lives. Daniel's own advocacy work had expanded beyond the borders of Kentucky. He testified before Congress about the need for federal legislation protecting children from isolation abuse, served as a consultant to law enforcement agencies investigating similar cases, and had written a memoir that became required reading in social work programs across the country. "The children who died in that compound can't be brought back," Daniel said as the memorial service concluded, "but their memory can serve as a shield, protecting other children from similar fates. Every policy we change, every warning sign we teach people to recognize, every intervention we make possible honors their sacrifice and gives meaning to their suffering." As the crowd dispersed, leaving flowers and small mementos at the base of the memorial stone, the wildflowers swayed in the gentle breeze. The compound's walls were gone, its buildings reduced to memories and legal documents, but the lives it had claimed and the survivors it had shaped would continue to influence how America protects its children for generations to come. The legacy of the Whitlock compound was not the horror of what had happened within its walls, but the determination of those who survived to ensure that such horrors could never happen again.